You're on 94.9 this morning. It's 12 minutes past 8 and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Good morning, Mick.
Now, Dr. John, normally at this time of the morning we have a life hack. And I thought this morning I might start off with a bit of a life hack and ask you a question in regards to my life hack, and that is, how do you get better family entertainment in the morning, something that's uplifting, something that's good for people, something that is good for the family and will help people wake up happy?
Oh, well, obviously the answer is listening to Christian radio, isn't it, Mick?
Oh, there we go, we go.
And, look, I think it's just wonderful, actually, that we do have Christian radio, because where else would you get a Christian view in our society these days? I mean, we live in a society where, it's really the cult of the expert. And every time you turn on the TV, they've got some expert in something giving their opinion on whatever it happens to be. But the media are not interested in hearing the Christian view about anything, and Christian radio is really the main way that we can get things across to people, like we do on Tuesday mornings.
Yes.
And I know you guys have had your appeal going on. I think it's really encourage all the regular listeners to pitch in and help, because if we didn't have Christian radio, we wouldn't hear the Christian view or the Christian voice at all in our society, because the mainstream media are not interested.
Yeah. Now, of course, most of our audience is right here on the Central Coast. We believe our numbers up above that 50,000 mark, probably approaching 60,000. But we don't really know our full numbers, because over the last few days in particular, I've had calls from people overseas. Of course, I had an ex-exchange student listening to us from Denmark this morning, but I was speaking to a lady yesterday who was living in Indonesia, and every time there was a call to prayer for the Muslim community, of course it was quite loud, and so they'd go and turn Rima on. And that's in Indonesia. They'd turn our station on and listen to us over there, which is pretty cool. And, of course, we've had people from the island, South Pacific, lots of people all over the world that have been tuning in via the internet, and we really don't know how many of them there are. So it's great to know that we're I guess, helping people in all those areas. And there are some pretty awesome programs, including, of course, your program, Dr. John.
Well, we've had questions from overseas too.
Yes.
And look, let me just encourage this morning any of the overseas listeners, text in your questions. We'd love to hear from you, and we know that we have had questions come in from overseas, and they're the sort of things that we really want to answer. Direct our what we talk about to the things that people are really interested in. So everybody out there, text in your questions. Don't ring them in, because we can't receive voicemail, but text the questions in and we'll address them week after week.
Absolutely. And the line to send your SMS or text through to is 0401 949 949. Now, of course, it is our June appeal. Our tally so far, $61,187. It's the last day of the appeal. There are hours left, and we're believing for a great end to the month. And we'd love your support. If you can support us, of course, give us a call after about 9:15 on 4367 4042. Or you can go to the REMA website, that's rhema.cc, and you can give securely online with all donations over $2 tax deductible. When we come back, we'll be talking to Dr. John about last week's news and some of the questions that have come in last week. Everything to do with creation, evolution, and all sorts of other things as well. And we're with Dr. John in the studio. Dr. John is from Creation Ministries International, and he'll be answering your questions this morning. Send your questions through to 0401 949 949. That is a text line. Hey, Dr. John, we had a question that came in last week because, of course, we were talking about DNA last week and Black Lives Matter, and particularly about, I think it was mitochondrial Eve and something atom, same sort of thing, yeah. And one of the questions that came in is, what do you think about the claim that we're 98% monkey? Now, let me just add that I did a bit of research and I found out that our DNA is 60% banana. True story. Us, humans, we're 60% banana.
Interesting, isn't it? And it's interesting that question came in about our sharing 98% of our DNA with monkeys or chimpanzees or whatever. And I was only thinking, when you start talking about a topic, and as you said, we're on the topic of racism and Black Lives Matter, it provokes questions from right out of left field, not exactly related to the thing that you're talking about, but obviously semi-related issues that people pick up on. And, of course, as you said, we've been talking about Black Lives Matter and the relationship between teaching evolution in schools and racism and so on. And we made the point that while schools continue to teach evolution, we're always going to have racism rearing its ugly head, because Darwin was the ultimate racist. He believed in the higher evolution of the white races and the lower evolution of the darker-skinned races. That's what he taught. That's what his books are full of. The one on Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. That was what Darwin believed. That's what he taught. And if you teach that in schools, then that's the sort of thing that kids are going to pick up. And you ask every school child in the secular system now where we came from, they'll all tell you that we came from monkeys, because that's what the teaching talks about. And, when you see some of the things that are going on around the world at the moment, associated protest movements with that Black Lives Matter, like trying to deface statues of Captain Cook and things like that, why don't they talk about changing the name of the city of Darwin, or changing the name of Charles Darwin University or something like that, because they are definitely racist names. So really, while they're at it, the politically correct ought to be looking at some of those things. Yeah.
I also find it interesting, Dr. John, that if we share 60% of our DNA with bananas, and me as a white man, I'm sort of yellowish, maybe Darwin, if he knew, he would have said that I evolved from a banana. It's 26 minutes past 8, and I'm with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, and we've been talking about DNA. Now, apparently I share about 90% of my DNA with a cat. Yeah, I sort of don't see that at all. But banana, it comes to the colouring. 60% of my DNA shared with a banana. Dr. John, we're talking about DNA and the percentage of DNA that we share with different things.
Yeah, look, Mick, and look, it's a very interesting question, and people need to think about that a little bit, because all living things have very, very similar DNA. Now, the reason we do is DNA is a code. It's like a computer program, but it's made up of the sequence of 4 nucleotide bases. That's only 4. And for simplicity, and so that you can see that it's a code or a program, we give them their first letters, A, T, G, and C. And the program is the order of those bases, the A, T, G, and C, in whatever order that God has designed. But if you think about it this way, if you had 2 computers side by side randomly generating a string of 4 letters, A, T, G, and C, just randomly generating it, and then you compared the 2 strings, on average, they would be 25% similar to start with, even on a random basis. So the comparison doesn't start at 0, it starts at 60%. It starts at 25%. Yep. And it's true that a lot of your DNA, like a lot of living DNA, would be 60% like a banana, and probably getting up to 80 or something like a cat, because it's a living thing. It has blood, it has a respiratory system, and it has all of those things that you have. So the likelihood of them being quite similar is fairly high. But look, that claim that I want to address is the one about the 98% similarity of our DNA with a chimp.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about where that came from, because it was actually first quoted in a paper that was published back in 1975. And the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins repeated it in one of his books in the mid-1980s. Now, remember, 1975 started, Dawkins repeated it in the mid-1980s. Yep. But what did we say last week? Last week, remember, we talked about the Human Genome Project,
yes,
the project to map the entire human genome, all 3 billion of our DNA letters. That started in 1990, and it wasn't completed until 2003. And the chimp genome has never been completed, right? So how could those guys back in 1975 or the mid-1980s make that statement when even the human genome wasn't completed until 2003? See, so you have to think.
I'm feeling a lot better now, Dr. John. I'm thinking maybe I'm not a banana.
No. Well, I think the bananas are going to go in their direction, because they made that claim not on the basis of genuine evidence. And when we come back, we'll talk about what I think they were basing their claim on.
Oh, this is exciting. You're on 94.9 this morning. We've got the weather and traffic coming up shortly. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. He's answering your questions. Send them through to our text line on 0401 949 949. And we've been talking about DNA this morning and how we share 98% of our DNA with apes and 60% with bananas. Well, Dr. John, I know a bit about computers. And I remember when I first started sort of writing programs. That was when DOS was around. That's Disk Operating System, MS-DOS. And one of the basic commands was CLS. And that meant clear screen. That's just one line of code. Now, every program out there, didn't matter what the programs were, and they could be completely different programming. One could be a game, one could be accounting, one could be, something completely different. They all had to clear the screen. So, of course, they all shared some code. And from what you're telling us about DNA, it's basically the programming for us. So, with a banana, there's part of the program that says, hey, there's so much fat in here, there's so much carbohydrate in here, there's so much of this, so much of that. And so we share lots of similar code regardless. And it only stands to reason that something that looks more like us would have more similar code. And it's like saying, look, just because that photo looks a lot like that photo, they must come from the same place. No, that's just an assumption. The bottom line is they're sharing code. Am I correct?
Yes, you're pretty much spot on, Mick. And because we look similar, and because things like bananas are food for us, then it stands to reason that a lot of the DNA sequences in them are going to be the same.
Wow! But
we're not actually 98% similar to chimp. Even if we were, and we can talk about that, that means there's a huge difference anyway. But what I was doing was explaining where that came from. Now, remember last week we talked about our DNA, and we said it's a great long string of those 4 letters, and there are about 3 billion of them in the string. And remember, we talked about the number of volumes that the printout took when it was first done. And I mentioned that in real life it's actually broken up into about 46 volumes, which are called chromosomes. Yep. And if you have a look at the long string that comprises each chromosome, that in itself is broken up largely into segments that we call genes, right? And a lot of those genes code for proteins, and proteins are things like hormones and muscle protein and all the other sorts of things that make up our bodies. And in all living things, those types of proteins are very similar. And I think that's where they got the original 98% from, because some of the proteins and hormones are very, very similar. For example, insulin is a hormone. It's a protein. And before we got the human insulin for diabetics, and we're only going back about 20 years, before that, diabetics used to inject themselves with pig insulin, which worked very, very well. Obviously, there was a good supply of it available as well. But pig insulin differs from human insulin in only one amino acid, which is a very small difference. Each amino acid is coded for by 3 of those nucleotide bases. So it's very, very similar, maybe only one of those difference in the whole of the protein sequence. So that's where the 98% similarity came from. There's been a lot of work done on it, the comparison of human and chimp DNA over the years, and most of the scientific reports that you read usually pay lip service or homage to that 98% because they want the paper published, but buried in most of those articles is the actual truth, and the truth is that it's probably only about 90%. Or even possibly less. So, yeah, look, it's a figure that's bandied around. But if you want to think about that, if we had 3 billion letters in our DNA, even a 2% difference would be about 60 million DNA letters. Now, that's an awful lot. And bear in mind, for one thing to evolve into another, you need to mutate or change one of those letters, and it happens one letter at a time. So it would take a long time to change 60 million of them.
Yeah, and it would have to be a positive step every time.
That's right, and nearly all of them are negative steps. And not only that, you see, a one-letter change is a very, very trivial mutation, and that doesn't have any outward effect on the whole organism, because the only thing that a complete organism can select for is some characteristic trait, like a faster cheetah or a faster gazelle or something like that. And you would need lots and lots and lots of single point mutations to produce that. So really, the whole idea of anything evolving into anything else is absolute nonsense. It's just impossible.
Yeah.
And it's never been observed either, which is what believed but not observed. So really, you can discount mutations as one of the drivers of evolution. The only other one that's mentioned, of course, is natural selection or adaptation, and that happens all the time. But again, we've talked about that, and we've talked about how that actually loses information, and it's never been observed to gain any information that wasn't already there. So anyway, they're the drivers of evolution, and both of them will not work. They go in the wrong direction.
There we go. I've got to say, though, I have noticed a similarity between me and bananas. I peel bananas when I want to eat them, and if I go out in the sun too long, I peel as... Now, I'm in the studio with Dr. John. We've been talking a bit about DNA this morning, and fortunately how I didn't come from a banana, or a monkey for that matter. And Dr. John, in the news last week, we also saw stuff in regards to Stonehenge. Now, we've seen that many times. People have had all sorts of speculative stories about what it is and what it's for and why it's there, and now all of a sudden they've found a bunch of shafts in a circle way, way outside, but around Stonehenge.
Yes, Mick, and one of the things that they did, I read that article as well, and I thought it was very, very interesting because in one of the pits they found quite a lot of remains, human bones and shells and things like that. And of course, in order to try and establish a date, they sent off the various artefacts for carbon dating. Well, the shells came back at about 8,000 BC, and the bones came back at about 1100 BC. So there's quite a substantial difference. And they said in the article that they decided that the date for the shells was unreliable. Now, why did they decide it was unreliable? because it didn't match up with what they thought it ought to be.
Yeah.
And that really is the way things happen with radioactive dating. If the answer comes back what you think it ought to be, then you say, right, okay, it's a good date. But if it comes back right out of the ballpark, then it's an unreliable date. So radioactive dating is not what people think it is. It's certainly not what it's cracked up to be. And really, it only encourages you to believe what you already had decided the date was. So really, it's not an objective method of determining a date. But I thought that 1100 BC actually was a very, very interesting answer, because it comes up with pretty much the time that we believe that Britain was founded. When you think about it, Britain gets its name from a guy called Brutus, and Brutus was a descendant of one of the guys involved in the siege of Troy, probably the most famous battle in history, where the Greeks besieged Troy, and they put the famous wooden horse as a present, and it went in through the walls, and out came the soldiers, and they conquered the city. After, I think it had been under siege for about 13 years. It was a long, long time.
Wow, yeah.
But anyway, Brutus, I think, was a descendant of the Trojans, and got out of there and went across and managed to begin Britain. And that's where the Britons got their name from, this guy Brutus. And that was about 1100 BC. And I read in another article, unrelated to that, how DNA from the early British people seemed to have a Mediterranean origin, which of course would fit in with that. So really, it's a very, very interesting thing. And when you look at the king lists of some of the peoples, because all of those European nations were settled by people who came out of the dispersion from Babel, right? And most of the European nations are descended from Noah's son Japheth. Right now, when you have a look at the king lists of the various nations, like the Celtic king lists from Ireland, and the king lists from the Vikings and the Saxons, what you find is that the first 4 or 5 of them are the same, and then they diverge. Now, we know that the dispersion from Babel was in the 5th generation after the flood. So all of them have got the same first 4 or so ancestors, and then the king lists diverge. So it's a really interesting confirmation of what the Bible tells us about the confusion of languages at Babel, about 5 generations after the flood, and then the dispersion thereafter. So really, I think you can find a lot from some of the discoveries that we make. And there we are. We think that the early bones there at Stonehenge date to about 1100 BC.
Could have been the first people. But we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. He's been talking to us just now about discoveries. Yeah, we were talking about Stonehenge and how they've discovered these new circles and bones. And at the end of the day, the science points to what was already written in the Bible. And more science keeps pointing to what's in the Bible, Dr. John.
All the time, Mick. And the only reason we really focus on the verification of these discoveries to the truth of the Bible is because of the most important truth of the Bible, and that's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And it's so important that everybody knows that he's God's Messiah, that he is part of the Godhead, that he's coming back to judge the entire earth when he returns. And we are all called, without exception, to submit to his lordship while there's still time to do it. and receive the forgiveness that he offers. And we are all going to need in the next couple of years, I reckon, the protection that is promised by Psalms and various other passages of Scripture, because the times ahead are going to be very, very difficult. You know, you mentioned this morning about the World Health Organization say it's going to get worse, and truly it is going to get worse, and there are going to be great times of trouble and tribulation ahead. We need to be prepared for that, but above all, we need to be submitted to the Lordship of Jesus and accept the protection that His Word promises to us.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we've got to do our best job here at Rhema to get that word out, to get the word, to get Jesus, the word, out to the public, out to everybody we possibly can. And it is our June appeal. It's the last day. We're in the last hours of our June appeal, and we're appealing to everybody who listens, who feels that we're, a great part of the Central Coast, to support us and keep the programs going that we have going into the future. And, of course, to give, you can just call 4367 4042 after about 9:15.